The sun hung in the cloudless Arizona sky like a burning eye, watching as Rebecca Ann Armstrong staggered through the scorching desert. Her once pristine blue dress was now tattered and dust-covered, her fair skin angry with blisters from 3 days under the relentless summer heat of 1875. The stagecoach attack had left her the sole survivor, wandering desperately toward what she hoped was civilization, her parched lips too dry to even call for help anymore. Xavier Vance spotted her from half a mile away, a stumbling figure wavering like a mirage against the shimmering horizon. He nudged his stallion forward, squinting beneath his wide-brimmed hat. At 28, he'd seen his share of death in these unforgiving territories, but something about this woman's determined struggle stirred something within him. "Hold on there," he called, galloping closer. His voice sounded strange to his own ears after days of solitude driving cattle north. "Madam, can you hear me?" Rebecca collapsed to her knees just as he reached her, her sun-bleached auburn hair falling across her face. Her blue eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, locked onto his with desperate clarity. "Water," she managed, the word barely a whisper from her cracked lips. Xavier dismounted in a fluid motion, reaching for his canteen. It was nearly empty, just enough for him to reach the next water hole if he was careful. Without hesitation, he uncorked it and knelt beside her. "Here," he said, but her trembling hands couldn't grasp it. Making a quick decision, Xavier poured the last of his water into her cupped hands, watching as she brought the precious liquid to her mouth with desperate gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered after drinking. "They attacked the stagecoach 3 days ago, everyone else." Her voice faltered. "Don't talk now," Xavier said, helping her to her feet. "Town of Copper Creek's about 8 miles north. My horse can carry us both." As he lifted her onto his stallion, he noted the stubborn strength behind her exhaustion. This wasn't some delicate city woman, there was grit in her eyes that matched the harshness of the territory around them. "I'm Xavier Vance," he said, mounting behind her and supporting her with one arm. "Most folks call me X." "Rebecca Armstrong," she managed before leaning back against his chest, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. "People call me Becca." Xavier felt a strange protectiveness surge through him as they rode toward town. He'd spent years avoiding attachments, moving from ranch to ranch, but something about this woman's fierce will to survive resonated with him in ways he couldn't explain. The town doctor, a graying man named Emmett Porter, took one look at Rebecca and ushered them into his small clinic. "Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and these blisters need tending," he muttered, examining her. "She's lucky you found her when you did, Vance. Another few hours." Xavier nodded grimly, standing awkwardly by the door. "I'll check on her tomorrow," he said finally, turning to leave. "Wait," Rebecca called, her voice stronger after several cups of water. "How will I repay you? You gave me your last water." Xavier paused, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No need, madam, just doing what anyone would." "Not anyone," she countered, her blue eyes holding his. "Not everyone would empty their canteen for a stranger in the desert." He tipped his hat and stepped out into the dusty street, unsure why her words had affected him so deeply. At the saloon, he rented a room and ordered a whiskey, his thoughts repeatedly returning to those determined blue eyes. The next morning, Xavier found Rebecca sitting on the doctor's porch, her face still red but her posture straight and alert. She wore a borrowed dress that was slightly too large, her auburn hair neatly braided down her back. "Mr. Vance," she greeted him, standing. "I was hoping you'd come by." "Just checking that you're recovering, madam," he said, his hat in his hands. "Thanks to you." She gestured to the chair beside her. "Would you sit a moment? Dr. Porter says I need another day of rest before traveling." Xavier sat, noticing how the morning light caught the golden flecks in her eyes. "Traveling where, if you don't mind my asking?" "Tucson," she replied. "My uncle owns a mercantile there. I was coming from St. Louis to help him run it after my aunt passed." Her expression clouded. "The stagecoach was carrying all my possessions. Everything's gone now." "Bandits have been hitting the eastern routes hard lately," Xavier said. "Sheriff's been trying to organize passes, but there's too much territory to cover." "Were you passing through as well?" she asked. Xavier shook his head. Driving cattle to the railroad at Prescott, my boys can handle the final stretch without me. I was heading back to my ranch near Tucson. Rebecca's eyes brightened. Then we're heading the same direction. Seems so, Xavier agreed, surprised at the pleasure this coincidence brought him. I could escort you if you'd allow it. Roads aren't safe for a woman traveling alone. I would be most grateful, she said. Though I warn you, Mr. Vance, I'm not as helpless as yesterday's circumstances might suggest. Xavier found himself smiling. Never thought you were, Miss Armstrong. 2 days later, they set out for Tucson. The doctor had insisted Rebecca was fit to travel, and Xavier had purchased supplies for the 3-day journey. He'd also acquired a gentle mare for Rebecca to ride. Have you been out west long? Xavier asked as they rode side by side through the saguaro-dotted landscape. Only in letters from my uncle, Rebecca admitted. I was raised in St. Louis. My parents died of fever 5 years ago, and I've been teaching school since then. Teaching? Xavier raised an eyebrow. Not many school teachers in these parts. That's what my uncle wrote, said Tucson's growing and needs educated women. She adjusted her hat against the sun. What about you? You seem like you belong to this land. Xavier's eyes scanned the horizon habitually. Came west after the war, fought for the Union, couldn't settle back home in Pennsylvania afterward. He didn't elaborate on the nightmares that had driven him to seek open spaces and solitude. Started with nothing but worked cattle drives until I could buy my own spread. You have a ranch? She asked, genuine interest in her voice. Small one south of Tucson, Circle V, just 20 hands but good grazing land with reliable water. He spoke of it with quiet pride. Not much, but it's mine. It sounds wonderful, Rebecca said sincerely. To build something of your own, that's the promise of the West, isn't it? Their conversation flowed easily as they rode, and Xavier found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years about the cattle drive where he'd nearly been trampled, the time he'd helped deliver a calf during a thunderstorm, the first time he'd seen the desert bloom after spring rains. That evening, as they made camp by a small creek, Xavier felt more at ease than he could remember feeling in a long time. He built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. Thank you, Rebecca said as he handed her a tin plate. Not just for the food, for everything. Most men would have left me at the first town. Most men haven't seen what happens to folks traveling alone out here, Xavier replied, settling across from her. Rebecca studied him in the firelight. You've lost people, haven't you? Xavier stared into the flames. My brother, 2 years ago. Ambushed by Apaches while we were checking fence lines. He rarely spoke of Thomas, but something about Rebecca made the words come easier. He was the talker in the family, always said I was too serious. I'm sorry, she said softly. Was he younger? By 3 years. Always looking to me to get him out of trouble. Xavier sipped his coffee. What about you? Any siblings? A sister. Sarah, she married a banker and moved to Chicago. Rebecca's expression grew wistful. We write, but it's not the same. She doesn't understand why I'd come to such a wild place, as she calls it. And why did you? Xavier asked. Truth be told, your sister has a point. This territory isn't kind to most. Rebecca set down her plate. Because I was suffocating, Mr. Vance. Teaching the same lessons to the same family's children, attending the same social functions, being evaluated as a potential wife by men who wanted someone decorative and silent. Her eyes reflected the fire's glow. I want to be useful, to build something meaningful. My uncle's offer came when I was at my most desperate for change. Xavier nodded slowly, recognizing the restlessness in her words. It wasn't unlike his own need for open skies after the war. Xavier, he said suddenly, if we're traveling together, you might as well use my name. She smiled and something in his chest tightened. Then I'm Becca to my friends. Are we friends then? He asked, half teasing. I'd like to think a man who gives his last water to save my life has earned that right, she replied, her eyes meeting his across the flames. The next morning, they broke camp early to avoid the worst of the day's heat. As they rode, Xavier pointed out landmarks and shared the names local tribes had given to various mountains and rock formations. You know a lot about the native peoples, Becca observed. Had an Apache guide for my first 2 years here, Xavier explained. Nantai taught me how to track, how to find water, which plants could heal or harm, saved my life more than once. What happened to him? She asked. Army forced his band onto the San Carlos reservation last year. Xavier's voice held old anger. Wasn't right, they'd kept peace with settlers for years. Becca was quiet for a moment. The newspapers back east paint a very different picture. Papers print what sells, Xavier said. Truth's usually more complicated. Good and bad on both sides, but the Indians are losing their way of life while we build ours on their land. He gestured to the mountains in the distance. Nantai said those were sacred to his people for generations. Their second night, they camped near an abandoned way station. The small adobe structure was partially collapsed, but its walls provided welcome shelter from the wind that had picked up. Xavier had just returned from securing the horses when he noticed Becca examining her blistered hands. The reins, he said, kneeling beside her. Should have given you gloves. I'll toughen up, she replied, though he could see the pain in her eyes. Without asking, Xavier reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin of salve. Nantai's wife made this. Aloe and other plants, works wonders on burned skin. He took her hands in his, surprised at how small they felt. Gently, he applied the salve, aware of her eyes on his face as he worked. You have healer's hands for such a rough man, she said softly. Xavier looked up, suddenly conscious of their closeness. Her face was inches from his, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of their small lantern. Had practiced patching up cowboys, he said gruffly, releasing her hands and standing. Should get some rest, long ride tomorrow. That night, Xavier lay awake, listening to Becca's steady breathing from the other side of the small room. He'd insisted she take the only intact corner while he slept near the door. The strange feeling in his chest when he'd held her hands troubled him. He hadn't allowed himself to feel such things since before the war, hadn't wanted the complications, the vulnerability. Yet there was something about Rebecca Armstrong that cut through the careful distance he maintained from others. Perhaps it was the courage she'd shown, wandering alone in the desert rather than surrendering to death. Or maybe it was the way she looked at this harsh country not with fear, but with appreciation for its wild beauty. The third day brought them within sight of Tucson. The town had grown considerably since Xavier had last visited, with new buildings extending the main street and more traffic on the roads leading in. Your uncle's mercantile, do you know where it is? Xavier asked as they approached. Harris Street, he wrote. Near the church, Becca replied, her expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. As they rode into town, however, Xavier noticed her growing increasingly tense. Something wrong? He asked. Becca hesitated. It's just, I haven't seen Uncle William in 15 years. What if he's changed his mind about wanting my help? What if I'm not what he expected? Xavier gave her a reassuring smile. Any man with sense would be grateful to have you arrive safely after what you've been through. They found the mercantile easily enough, a substantial two-story building with Armstrong General Goods painted across its wooden facade. Xavier helped Becca dismount, aware of how reluctant he felt to see their journey end. Would you come in with me? She asked, surprising him. Just for a moment, of course, he agreed, tying their horses to the hitching post. The store was well stocked but empty of customers when they entered. A bell above the door announced their arrival, and a tall, white-haired man emerged from a back room. Can I help you? He asked, then froze, staring at Becca. Rebecca, is that you? Uncle William, she said, stepping forward. The older man's face broke into a wide smile as he rushed to embrace her. My dear girl, we'd nearly given up hope when the news about the stagecoach reached us. The sheriff said there were no survivors. There almost weren't, Becca replied, returning his embrace before turning to Xavier. This is Xavier Vance. He saved my life in the desert. William Armstrong turned to Xavier with tears in his eyes. Sir, I cannot begin to express my gratitude. My wife's passing left me alone in the world until Rebecca agreed to come west. To think I might have lost her too. Anyone would have done the same, Xavier said, uncomfortable with the man's emotion. Nonsense, William insisted, pumping Xavier's hand vigorously. You must stay for dinner. In fact, I insist you stay as our guest for as long as you're in town. Xavier glanced at Becca, whose eyes seemed to echo her uncle's invitation. That's kind, but I should be getting back to my ranch. Been away longer than planned. At least stay tonight, Becca said softly. You've ridden hard these past days. Something in her voice made it impossible to refuse. One night then. Dinner that evening was more elaborate than anything Xavier had eaten in months. William had closed the store early and hired the Mexican woman who helped with cleaning to prepare a feast of chicken, beans, fresh bread, and even a peach cobbler for dessert. Throughout the meal, William peppered them with questions about their journey, growing increasingly outraged at the stagecoach attack. These outlaws grow bolder by the day, he fumed. The territorial governor promises more lawmen, but they never materialize. The territory's too vast, Xavier observed. Even with more men, it's impossible to patrol effectively. That's why we need statehood, William said passionately. Arizona deserves proper governance and protection. As the evening progressed, Xavier found himself studying Becca in this new setting. The desert journey had revealed her strength, but here he glimpsed other facets: her quick mind as she discussed politics with her uncle, her graceful movements as she helped clear the table, her kindness toward the Mexican servant woman whose name she made a point of learning and using. After dinner, William excused himself to finish some bookkeeping, leaving Xavier and Becca alone on the small porch behind the store. Your uncle seems a good man, Xavier said, breaking the comfortable silence. He is, Becca agreed. My mother always said he had the kindest heart in the family. She turned to face him. Will you really leave tomorrow? Xavier nodded, though the prospect held less appeal than it should. Ranch won't run itself. My foreman Thomas is capable, but he'll be wondering where I am. Of course, she said, looking away. These past days have been. She trailed off, seeming unsure how to continue. Different, Xavier supplied. For me too, her eyes met his again. I've never met anyone like you, Xavier. Most men I've known would have seen me as a burden, an inconvenience. You've been nothing but kind and respectful. You make it easy, he admitted. Most women I've encountered out here are either looking for a husband or avoiding men altogether. You're something else entirely. A smile touched her lips. Is that a compliment? The highest I know how to give, he said honestly. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Xavier found himself wanting to reach for her hand but held back. This woman deserved better than a rough rancher with too many dark memories. I should turn in, he said finally. Early start tomorrow. Becca nodded, though disappointment flickered in her eyes. Good night, then, and thank you again for everything. Xavier lay awake in the guest room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town. He'd grown accustomed to Becca's presence, these past days the rhythm of her breathing as she slept, the questions she asked as they rode, the surprising humor that emerged as she grew more comfortable with him. The thought of returning to his solitary life at the Circle V suddenly seemed less appealing than it had a week ago. Morning came too quickly. Xavier rose before dawn, packing his few possessions and stepping quietly downstairs. To his surprise, Becca was already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. Thought I'd see you off properly, she said, handing him a steaming cup. Uncle says to thank you again. He's still sleeping. Xavier accepted the coffee gratefully. No need for thanks. I'm glad you're safe and settled. They moved to the back porch, where the first light of dawn was just breaking over the eastern mountains. Xavier found himself searching for words, wanting to say something meaningful but unsure what that might be. Will you come to town again soon? Becca asked, breaking the silence. Don't make it in often, he admitted. Ranch keeps me busy. Of course, she said, her eyes dropping to her cup. Well, if you do come, please stop by. I'd like to hear how you're faring. Xavier nodded, finishing his coffee. I should get going. At the hitching post where his horse waited, Becca handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. Some food for your journey, she explained. And she hesitated before continuing. I've enclosed my parents' copy of Leaves of Grass. The poetry helped me during difficult times. Perhaps you might enjoy it too. Touched by the gesture, Xavier carefully placed the package in his saddlebag. Thank you, Becca. I'll return it when I can. Keep it, she insisted. A small repayment for my life. As he mounted, Xavier looked down at her standing in the early morning light, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. No repayment necessary, he said softly. Stay safe, Rebecca Armstrong, and you, Xavier Vance, she replied, stepping back as he turned his horse toward the south road. Xavier had barely reached the outskirts of Tucson when he reined in his horse. The idea of not seeing Becca again struck him with unexpected force. These past days had awakened something he'd thought long buried: a desire for connection, for sharing his life with someone who understood both strength and gentleness. He sat there for long minutes, weighing his options. The ranch was his life's work, built from nothing but sweat and determination. Yet for the first time, it seemed incomplete: a place of work rather than a true home. Before he could reconsider, Xavier turned his horse around and galloped back toward town. He found Becca in the mercantile, arranging bolts of fabric on a shelf. She looked up in surprise as the bell announced his entry. "Xavier, did you forget something?" "Yes," he said, removing his hat as he approached. "I forgot to say what needs saying." Her hands stilled on the fabric. "And what's that?" "That in 3 days of traveling together, I've come to admire you more than any woman I've ever known," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "That the thought of riding away and maybe never seeing you again sits wrong in my chest. That I'd like permission to call on you properly if you're amenable." Color rose in Becca's cheeks. Yes, I would like that very much." A throat cleared behind them, and they both turned to see William watching from the doorway to the storeroom, a knowing smile on his face. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I thought you'd be halfway to your ranch by now." "Had a change of plans, sir," Xavier replied, straightening. "With your permission, I'd like to court your niece." William looked between them, his expression softening. "Rebecca is her own woman, Mr. Vance. Her decisions are hers to make." He paused, then added, "But for what it's worth, you have my blessing." Over the weeks that followed, Xavier made the ride to Tucson more times than he had in the previous year combined. Each visit revealed new facets of Becca that deepened his affection: her determination to learn the mercantile business, her kindness to the town's children who quickly discovered her background as a teacher, her willingness to listen to the stories of the Mexican and Indian women who came to trade. For her part, Becca found excuses to visit the Circle V when her uncle could spare her, bringing baked goods for the ranch hands and spending hours riding the property with Xavier. She proved a quick study in ranch operations, asking insightful questions and offering suggestions that sometimes surprised Xavier with their practicality. 3 months after their first meeting in the desert, Xavier took Becca to his favorite spot on the ranch, a high ridge overlooking the valley, where wildflowers grew in surprising abundance thanks to a small spring. "It's beautiful," Becca said, dismounting and walking to the edge to take in the view. "I can see why you love it here. Reminds me there's more to this land than harshness," Xavier replied, joining her. "That beauty can survive in unlikely places." Becca turned to him with a smile. "Like finding a cowboy with poetry books hidden in his cabin," Xavier laughed, caught. She discovered his small collection during her last visit: volumes of Whitman, Longfellow, and Dickinson, carefully preserved despite the dust and wear of ranch life. "Thomas, my brother, started me reading them during the war," he admitted. "Said we needed beautiful words to counter all the ugliness we were seeing." "He was wise," Becca said softly, reaching for his hand. Xavier took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Becca, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I know I'm not the kind of man you probably imagined for yourself. I'm rough-edged, set in my ways, and this life isn't easy." "Xavier," she interrupted, her eyes bright, "are you asking me to marry you?" He nodded, suddenly unable to find more words. "Then yes," she said simply. "Yes." Xavier pulled her into his arms, hardly believing his fortune. "Are you certain? The ranch is isolated, the work never ending. I've seen all that," she reminded him. "And I've seen how you treat your men with respect, how you know every cow by its markings, how you still save half your water when drinking because giving your last drop to a stranger became habit." She reached up to touch his face. "I love you, Xavier Vance." Desert sun, dust storms, cattle drives, and all. Their wedding took place that autumn, with William officiating and the entire ranch crew in attendance. Xavier's foreman Thomas served as best man, while a young Mexican woman who worked at the mercantile stood as Becca's maid of honor. William surprised them with a wedding gift, the deed to the vacant plot adjacent to the mercantile. "For when you're in town," he explained, "build something that's yours together." Over the years that followed, the Circle V prospered under their joint stewardship. Becca established a small school for the ranch hands' children and neighboring homesteaders, teaching 3 days a week while helping manage the ranch accounts. Their first child, a daughter they named Eliza after Xavier's mother, arrived 2 years after their wedding, followed by a son, William Thomas, 2 years later. The small house they built in town became a gathering place when they visited Tucson, with Becca organizing reading circles for the community while Xavier participated in the growing movement for Arizona statehood. Though the territory wouldn't achieve that status until 1912, the groundwork laid by men like Xavier and William helped shape its future. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Becca back to the ridge where he'd proposed. The ranch had expanded, the house had grown, but the view remained unchanged, the vast desert stretching toward distant mountains, beautiful in its wild permanence. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked as they sat together watching the sunset. "Coming west?" "Marrying a rancher instead of some city gentleman?" Becca leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "Not for a single moment. That day in the desert when the sun had blistered my skin and I thought I might die there, I prayed not for rescue but for purpose, for a life that mattered." She looked up at him, the years having only enhanced the beauty he'd first seen in her determined blue eyes. "You gave me both." Xavier wrapped his arm around her, remembering the desperate woman he'd found stumbling through the desert and the strength she'd shown even then. "You saved me too, you know. I was surviving, not living before you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Xavier reflected on how a single act of kindness, pouring his last water into a stranger's hands, had changed the course of his life entirely. The desert that had nearly taken Becca's life had instead given them both a new one, together. In the gathering twilight, with the woman he loved beside him and their home waiting below, Xavier Vance finally felt complete. The loneliness that had driven him west after the war had been replaced by something he'd never thought to find in this harsh land: a family, a purpose, and a love as enduring as the mountains that witnessed their beginning.